In a dusty Montana auction ring, a bankruptcy judge's gavel was about to make the rich richer. 14 emaciated cows stood trembling, dismissed as worthless dog meat by the county's biggest cattle baron. But the woman who bought them for pocket change was about to bury his entire empire. The air inside the Billings Livestock Commission was thick with the smell of stale sawdust, spilled diesel, and the unmistakable stench of desperation. It was late August 2018, and the northern plains were in the suffocating grip of a historic drought. Oh, the kind of drought that didn't just crack the soil. It cracked bank accounts and broke generational family legacies. Sitting in the third row of the aluminum bleachers was Abigail Lawson. Her boots were worn through at the heels, and her bank account at Yellowstone Mercantile Bank hovered at a terrifying $1,142. She had spent the last 3 years clinging to a 50-acre patch of leased scrubland, trying to build a herd from scratch after her father's farm was aggressively bought out in foreclosure. The man who had bought her father's farm for pennies on the dollar was currently sitting in the front row, laughing loudly. Owen Caldwell was a man who looked exactly like the empire he ran, bloated, heavily leveraged, and entirely too confident. Caldwell Land and Cattle was the biggest operation in Garfield County. He ran over 3,000 head of pristine, registered Black Angus. He didn't farm with nature, he farmed with a checkbook, backed by massive lines of credit from Wall Street agricultural lenders. Caldwell believed in expensive grain, high-dollar genetics, and crushing his smaller neighbors into the dust. Sold $2,400 a head to Caldwell beef, bellowed Big Jim Taggart the auctioneer, his voice echoing off the corrugated tin roof. Caldwell tipped his Stetson to the crowd. He had just bought another 60 head of prime-bred heifers. The message was clear. While the drought was choking the small-timers out of business, Caldwell was using bank money to buy up the county. Abigail watched him with a tightening in her jaw. She was invisible to men like Caldwell. To them, she was a stubborn ghost, haunting land she couldn't afford to own. Then, Lot 412 was herded into the ring. A collective groan rippled through the bleachers. Even Big Jim Taggart lowered his microphone, rubbing the bridge of his nose in disgust. 14 cows stumbled into the sawdust. They were a horrifying sight, matted, bony, and hollow-eyed. Their ribs jutted out like the framing of a ruined house. They were a ragtag mix of heritage breeds, some Corriente, some Piney Woods, maybe a little Longhorn. They had rough, faded coats and an air of absolute defeat. They had been seized from a neglect case 2 counties over and had been starving in a dry lot for months. "All right, folks, what do we have here?" Taggart sighed, his fast-talking auctioneer cadence completely vanishing. "A lot of 14 mixed scrub cows. They look like they've been to hell and haven't quite made it back. Not guaranteed bred, not guaranteed healthy. Who will give me 500 a head?" Silence. Not a single catalog moved. 300, Taggart pleaded. Owen Caldwell chuckled loudly enough for the whole arena to hear. "Jim, you couldn't pay me to put those walking diseases on my trailer. Send them to the dog food plant where they belong." The crowd murmured in agreement. Hank, the buyer for a low-grade pet food processing plant in Idaho, raised a lazy finger. "I'll give you $50 a head, Jim, for the meat." Abigail leaned forward. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Everyone else in the room saw walking corpses, but Abigail, who had spent her childhood reading her grandfather's journals on native grazing and heritage breeds, saw something else. She looked at their wide-set jaws, their thick hides, and the underlying skeletal structure that hinted at profound, untamed resilience. These weren't the pampered, corn-fed Angus that Caldwell loved. These were survivors. They had lived through months of starvation on sheer willpower. If they had survived that, what could they do with just a little bit of grass? "I've got 50 ahead from the packer," Taggart called out, raising his gavel. "Do I hear 60? Going once." Abigail stood up. 69. The entire arena went dead silent. Hundreds of heads swiveled to look at the woman in the dusty denim jacket standing in the third row. $69 a head? Taggart asked, squinting through the fluorescent lights. Abigail, honey, you sure? That's $966 for the whole lot. Let's call it $970. You really want to drag this mess home? I said $970 for the lot, Abigail repeated, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. In the front row, Caldwell turned around. He looked her up and down, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. Careful, little lady, he drawled. You're gonna spend your last dime just to pay for the backhoe to bury them. Oh. Abigail met his gaze, her eyes cold. Just ring it up, Jim. Sold. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. $970 to Abigail Lawson. As she walked down to the clerk's office to hand over almost every dollar she had to her name, she could hear the whispers of the older ranchers. Crazy. Delusional. She'll be bankrupt by Christmas. She paid the clerk in cash. As she backed her rusted, borrowed gooseneck trailer up to the loading chute, the 14 battered cows hesitated. Abigail didn't shout or use a cattle prod like the yard hands. She simply stood at the front of the trailer, rattling a small bucket of sweet feed, and spoke to them in a low, calm voice. One by one, they stepped out of the nightmare of the auction yard and into her trailer. She had just spent her last $970. She had 14 dying cows, and winter was only 3 months away. The drive back to Owyhee Creek took 2 hours. When Abigail finally dropped the trailer ramp onto her leased property, the reality of what she had done set in. Her land wasn't rolling green pastures. It was 50 acres of rugged, rocky coulees, covered in invasive Russian thistle, dry cheatgrass, and sagebrush. It was the kind of land that modern agronomists declared useless. The cows staggered out of the trailer, their heads hanging low. They looked worse in the harsh afternoon sunlight. Before Abigail could even unhook the trailer, her cell phone buzzed. It was David Gable, the senior loan officer at Yellowstone Mercantile Bank. Abby, Gable started, his tone clipped and professional. My desk just got a notification that you emptied your checking account at the Livestock Commission. Taggart called me. He told me what you bought. They're cattle, David. They're an asset, Abigail replied, defensively crossing her arms as she watched the herd sniff suspiciously at a patch of dry weeds. They are a liability, Abigail. You bought 14 culls. The drought is getting worse, and feed corn just hit a record high. Caldwell is securing a $2 million line of credit just to buy hay for his herd to survive the winter. How are you going to feed these animals? Your operating line is $5,000. I'm freezing it. I won't let the bank finance a mass grave. I don't need your feed money, David, Abigail snapped. Just give me 6 months. She hung up before he could argue. The truth was, Gable was right about the market. The drought had devastated the hay crop across the Midwest. A global supply chain bottleneck had sent diesel and fertilizer prices through the roof. The modern cattle industry, built on cheap grain and heavy machinery, was beginning to panic. Over at Caldwell, Land and Cattle, a fleet of tractors was running 12 hours a day, dumping custom mixed rations of corn, soy, and high-protein alfalfa into concrete bunks just to keep his massive Angus cows fat. Caldwell was burning through $10,000 a day in feed costs. Abigail had exactly $0 for feed, but she had a plan. While Caldwell practiced industrial farming, Abigail implemented something older and wilder, high-density rotational grazing, often called mob grazing. Armed with a single spool of polywire electric fencing and a solar charger, she fenced the cows into a space no bigger than a tennis court. The theory was simple. If you give cows a massive field, they will only eat the sweetest grass and leave the weeds, eventually destroying the good forage. But if you pack them tightly into a small space and move them every single day, their competitive instincts kick in. They eat everything: the dry cheatgrass, the bitter sage, the thorny Russian thistle. Their hooves churned the soil, stomping their own manure and urine into the dirt, instantly fertilizing the barren ground. On day 1, the scraggly cows looked at the thorny weeds in confusion. On day 3, hunger and competition took over. They began to eat. It was here that the worthless heritage genetics of Lot 412 revealed their secret. Modern Angus cattle had been bred for 100 years to eat rich, easily digestible grain. Their stomachs couldn't process rough, woody forage, but Abigail's scrub cows had stomachs like concrete mixers. They were descended from the wild cattle of the Spanish explorers and the deep, southern piney woods. They didn't just survive on the invasive weeds, they began to metabolize them with ferocious efficiency. By November, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Abigail moved her polywire fence twice a day, braving the biting wind. The transformation in the herd was miraculous. Their hollow sides filled out. Their matted, dull hair shed away, replaced by thick, glossy winter coats of red, brindle, and black. They were no longer walking corpses. They were built like tanks. Then came the Thanksgiving blizzard of 2018. It was a catastrophic weather event. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero, and 3 feet of snow buried Garfield County in 48 hours. The roads became impassable. For Owen Caldwell, the blizzard was a nightmare. His diesel tractors gelled up and wouldn't start. The feed trucks couldn't navigate the drifted county roads. His massive, genetically refined Angus cows stood in the open wind, freezing and bawling for the feed trough. They didn't know how to forage through the snow. Over the course of 4 days, Caldwell lost nearly 200 calves and dozens of cows to the freezing temperatures. His empire was hemorrhaging cash, and the bank was frantically calling his cell phone. 10 miles down the road, Abigail woke up in the dark, her heart in her throat. She bundled up in 4 layers and fought her way through the waist-deep drifts to the coulee where she had moved her herd before the storm hit. She expected to find 14 frozen bodies. Instead, she found 14 cows, huddled together in a natural bowl, protected from the wind. They were calm. More incredibly, they were using their hooves to aggressively scrape away the 3 feet of snow, accessing the cured dry grasses preserved underneath. They were entirely self-sufficient. Abigail fell to her knees in the snow, tears of sheer relief freezing on her cheeks. When spring finally broke, the snow melted to reveal a landscape forever altered. Caldwell's pastures were ruined, muddy, overgrazed, and littered with the financial ruin of dead livestock. He was deeply in debt, facing predatory interest rates on loans he had taken out just to buy emergency hay. But on Abigail's leased 50 acres, something incredible was happening. The severe winter mob grazing had done its job. The hooves of her cattle had driven organic matter into the dead soil. For the first time in a decade, rich, green native wheatgrass and clover began to explode from the dirt, entirely choking out the invasive weeds. And then came the ultimate twist. In late April, Abigail walked out to the pasture to find one of the brindle cows, cleaning off a wet, shivering, perfectly healthy calf. The next day, another calf was born. Then, another. The auctioneer had said they weren't guaranteed bred. Everyone assumed they were barren. But the heritage cows hadn't been barren. Their bodies had simply suspended their pregnancies while they were starving. Once Abigail had given them a proper diet, their biology kicked back in. By the end of May, 11 of the 14 cows had dropped strong, vigorous calves. Abigail stood leaning against her rusty truck, holding a thermos of coffee, watching 25 head of healthy cattle graze on lush, free grass. She had bought them for $970. She hadn't spent a single dime on feed, and in one season, her net worth had just skyrocketed. But across town, Owen Caldwell's financial house of cards was beginning to collapse. The bank was coming for his land, and Abigail Lawson, the woman he had mocked, was suddenly the only one in the county holding on to pure, unburdened profit. and she was about to make a phone call that would change Garfield County forever. The spring of 2019 bled into a scorching summer, and the economic landscape of the American West began to violently shift. Abigail Lawson did not return to the Billings Livestock Commission. She knew that playing the commodity market, where giant corporations dictated the price of beef per pound, was a rigged game designed to keep small ranchers in perpetual debt. Instead, she looked at her thriving herd, now numbering 25 head of robust, slick-haired cattle, and made a decision that would redefine her future. She wasn't going to sell live cattle. She was going to sell premium, pasture-raised beef. The heritage genetics of her herd, those worthless scrub cows, possessed a hidden superpower. Because they had spent centuries adapting to wild forage, their meat was entirely different from the pale, watery, corn-fed beef found in supermarkets. When Abigail harvested her first steer, using a local mobile butcher named Henderson, the results were astonishing. The meat was a deep, rich burgundy, laced with distinct, yellow-hued fat packed with beta-carotene and omega-3s from the native prairie grasses. Abigail loaded coolers into the back of a rusted truck and drove 4 hours south to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a town overflowing with high-end culinary demands. She didn't bother with grocery stores. She walked straight through the back alleys into the kitchens of five-star restaurants. She found Chef Wyatt Montgomery, a notoriously strict farm-to-table purveyor who ran the most exclusive steakhouse in the valley. Montgomery took one look at the deep crimson ribeye Abigail slapped onto his stainless steel prep table and immediately fired up his cast-iron skillet. No butter, no heavy seasoning, just fire and meat. When he took the first bite, the kitchen went entirely silent. The flavor profile was explosive, earthy, complex, and deeply savory, possessing a terroir that tasted exactly like the wild Montana sagebrush and sweet clover the animal had been raised on. "How many head do you have?" Chef Montgomery asked, wiping his chin. "I can guarantee you 5 steers this season," Abigail replied. 15 next year." "Oh, I'll take every single ounce," Montgomery said without hesitating. "And I'll pay you 3 times the commodity market rate. But you cannot sell this to anyone else in Jackson." Just like that, Abigail bypassed the entire industrial meat-packing cartel. With $0 spent on grain, tractors, or chemical fertilizers, her profit margins were completely unheard of in modern agriculture. By the time her 2019 calves were harvested, she had banked over $45,000 in pure cash. She immediately reinvested it, not in machinery, but in leasing another 200 acres of useless, weed-choked land, expanding her mob grazing operation. Then came the spring of 2020, and the world stopped turning. A global pandemic shattered the agricultural supply chain. Overnight, the massive corporate meatpacking plants that processed 80% of the nation's beef shut down due to outbreaks. For Owen Caldwell, this was a catastrophic death blow. Caldwell Land and Cattle operated on massive, highly leveraged volume. He had over 2,000 head of fat steers sitting in feedlots, ready for slaughter. But with the packing plants closed, there was nowhere to send them. Yet, the cattle still had to eat. Caldwell was trapped in a financial nightmare, forced to buy thousands of tons of sky-high grain to feed cattle he couldn't sell. Every single day, his feed bill was $15,000. He maxed out his operating lines. He took out emergency loans at predatory interest rates. He mortgaged his equipment. The drought had already weakened his empire, but the supply chain collapse snapped its spine. His cattle grew overly fat, losing their market value, while his bank accounts bled dry. Meanwhile, just 10 miles away, Abigail Lawson was watching her phone ring off the hook. Because the grocery store meat shelves were empty, panicked consumers were frantically searching for local beef. Abigail didn't rely on massive, centralized meat packers. She still used Old Man Henderson and his state-inspected mobile butchering rig. While Caldwell's multi-million-dollar empire was paralyzed, Abigail was processing her grass-fed heritage cattle right on the pasture and shipping custom-boxed beef directly to doorsteps across the state. She wasn't just surviving, she was printing money. By the end of 2021, Abigail's herd had naturally multiplied to over 80 head. Her 50-acre lease had grown to 400 acres of vibrantly restored carbon-rich soil, and sitting in her account at Yellowstone Mercantile Bank was an astonishing $312,000 in liquid, debt-free cash. It was exactly what she needed for the moment she had been waiting for since the day her father died. In late November of 2021, David Gable, the senior loan officer at Yellowstone Mercantile, was sitting in his corner office sweating through his suit. The bank examiners were breathing down his neck. Owen Caldwell's debt had ballooned to a staggering $4.2 million, and Caldwell had officially defaulted. The bank was forcing Caldwell to liquidate his assets. The first piece of property on the chopping block was the Willow Creek Tract, a sprawling 600-acre parcel featuring the best natural water access in Garfield County. It was also the exact piece of land Caldwell had ruthlessly foreclosed out from under Abigail's father 5 years earlier. Under Caldwell's management, Willow Creek had been devastated. He had overstocked it with heavy Angus cattle, letting them camp by the water and graze the native blue grama grass down to the dirt. The soil was compacted into concrete. The creek banks were eroded and collapsing. Because the land was currently considered ecologically dead, the bank's appraisal came in devastatingly low. Gable needed a buyer fast to stave off the regulators. He arranged a private distressed asset sale in the bank's boardroom. Caldwell, desperate to stop the hemorrhaging and save his own mansion, agreed to sign over the Willow Creek deed for a massive loss, provided a buyer could produce the cash immediately. Banks wouldn't finance dead dirt, so it had to be a cash buyer. Word around the county was that an out-of-state tech billionaire was sending a proxy to buy it for a hunting lodge. Caldwell took grim solace in that. At least he was losing it to a titan of industry. At 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, Caldwell sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Yellowstone Mercantile, nursing a glass of tepid water. He looked 10 years older. His face was gray, his arrogant swagger entirely evaporated under the crushing weight of impending bankruptcy. David Gable looked at his Rolex. "The buyer should be here any minute, Owen. Once the cashier's check clears, you sign the deed and we wipe $250,000 off your principal. It buys you another 90 days to liquidate the feedlot." Caldwell merely grunted, staring at the polished table. At 2:05 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. Caldwell didn't look up, expecting a lawyer in a tailored suit. Instead, the rhythmic, heavy thud of worn leather cowboy boots echoed across the hardwood floor. Caldwell raised his eyes. The color drained completely from his face. Standing in the doorway, wearing the exact same faded denim jacket she had worn at the Billings Livestock Commission 3 years prior, was Abigail Lawson. "What is this?" Caldwell choked out, slamming his hands on the table and half rising from his leather chair. He shot a venomous glare at the banker. "Gable, is this some kind of sick joke?" David Gable looked just as stunned. He fumbled with the paperwork in front of him. "Abigail, you can't be in here. This is a closed commercial transaction. The buyer is supposed to be here." "I am the buyer, David," Abigail said. Her voice was remarkably soft, entirely devoid of the frantic energy that usually filled rooms where millions of dollars were being lost. She walked over to the long mahogany table. She didn't sit down. She simply reached into the breast pocket of her jacket, pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper, and slid it across the polished wood. It came to rest perfectly between Gable and Caldwell. It was a certified cashier's check, drawn from Abigail's business account. The amount, printed in bold black ink, was $250,000, Caldwell stared at the check as if it were a venomous snake. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The man who had spent his life bullying his neighbors with Wall Street leverage could not comprehend the piece of paper in front of him. "You," Caldwell stammered, his eyes darting frantically from the check to Abigail's face. "There is no way. You were bankrupt. You bought a trailer full of dog meat. You don't have this kind of money." "I didn't buy dog meat, Owen," Abigail replied coldly. "I bought survivors. And while you were busy spending borrowed millions trying to force nature to do what you wanted, I was letting nature do the work for me." Gable grabbed the check, his hands visibly shaking. He logged into his terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard to verify the funds. A few seconds later, the screen blinked green. The money was real. It was sitting in her account, fully cleared, with tens of thousands left over. "It's good," Gable whispered, looking at Caldwell with a mixture of shock and pity. "Owen, she has the capital." "I am not selling my land to her," Caldwell roared, his face flushing dark purple. "I'll burn the deed first." "It's not your land, Owen, not anymore," Gable said, his banking instincts coldly taking over. "If you don't sign this today, the regulator sees your entire operation by Friday. The house, the feedlot, the trucks, everything. You have no leverage left." Caldwell stood trembling. He looked at Abigail. The sheer, unadulterated hatred in his eyes was palpable, but beneath it was something he had never felt before: utter defeat. He was a king without a kingdom, brought down not by a corporate rival, but by a ghost he thought he had buried. Slowly, agonizingly, Caldwell picked up the gold pen sitting on the table. His hand shook as he dragged the ink across the signature line of the deed transfer. When he finished, he threw the pen on the table, turned without a word, and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing the end of Caldwell land and cattle. Gable stamped the paperwork, pushing the finalized deed toward Abigail. "I have to admit, Abby," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "When you bought those culls, I told my wife you were the biggest fool in Garfield County. I was wrong." Abigail picked up the deed. It felt impossibly light for something that carried so much weight. "You weren't the only one, David," she said, turning toward the door. "Just remember this the next time a small farmer asks for a lifeline." The following April, the Willow Creek tract was unrecognizable to anyone who had seen it during the Caldwell years. Abigail had immediately implemented her high-density grazing protocol. Over the winter, she ran her 80 head of heritage cattle up and down the compacted creek banks, unrolling bales of native hay directly onto the worst, most barren patches of dirt. The cattle trampled the uneaten hay, their manure and their urine deep into the dead soil, creating a thick armor of biological compost. When the spring rains finally came, the land didn't just recover, it resurrected. Dormant seeds that had been buried under Caldwell's compacted dirt for years suddenly broke through the crust. Thick, knee-high stands of western wheatgrass, green needlegrass, and purple prairie clover blanketed the rolling hills. The creek banks stabilized. For the first time in a decade, Willow Creek ran crystal clear, filtering through deep roots instead of washing away topsoil. Abigail stood on the highest ridge overlooking the valley. The morning sun was burning off the low-hanging fog, casting a golden light over the landscape. Below her, the herd grazed peacefully. The 14 original, bony, broken cows that nobody wanted were down there, fat, content, and leading dozens of their healthy offspring through the tall grass. She reached down, plunging her bare hands into the soil. It was cool, dark, and smelled like life. She let the rich dirt sift through her fingers, closing her eyes as the morning wind swept through the valley. She was standing on her father's land. It was fully paid for. It was deeply healed, and it belonged entirely to her. What did you think of Abigail's journey? From a $970 gamble on 14 starving cows to reclaiming her family's legacy with zero debt. Her story proves that working with nature beats trying to outsmart it. If this true tale of resilience and triumph inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a great underdog story, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life videos. Don't forget to ring the notification bell today.